I've asked my English language teacher some questions about wine terms. I prepared an English test for you.
Please. I should be afraid.
My English teacher, John, is one of the best language teachers I've ever met in my life, but he doesn't consume much wine. So he's a very good example of a well-educated person, but without specific wine knowledge.
I know, you gave me a hard test there.
I also posed the same wine questions to two ultimate wine experts who have been masters of wine for more than 20 years. We're going to talk about strange wine terms. You will hear the explanations of wine terms from wine experts and from a non-wine English language expert. Because you're an English teacher, your English level is like this, and I just want to know if I use these kind of terms, how people would feel or interpret. If you Google with wine tasting terms, then you can get this information on the top. We will explain the terms in the order they are listed on the list. If you don't see the term you are looking for on this list, please watch part 1.
Strange wine term. Meaning that the terms are strange or that the wine is strange?
I said strange wine terms because they may sound strange to you, but they are actually professional wine terms. For example, astringent. This wine is astringent. How does it sound?
Sounds like a medicine or a beauty product. It's most popular in America as the oils that women would wash their face with. And the astringent nature of it closes the pores.
Oh, so it doesn't sound like something related to taste.
Yeah. In my mind,
I
having read almost no articles that delve deep into wines, if this is for the common person who doesn't know much, like this is the Trader Joe's Fearless Flyer, I wouldn't put astringency in there.
I had to drink this wine, but probably I'd better put it on my face.
Wow.
Wonderful.
I can bathe in it. But like I said, if you educate them, wonderful astringency, that you, something like that, then they'll go, astringency is something else too. Right? So almost any one of those terms, I think you could in fact educate them about.
People may have bought skin products or skin products that are known as astringents.
Yeah.
And so astringency means to dry out.
Oh, really?
Right. And so once you have these compounds in your mouth that sort of pucker and dry out your mouth, that's the astringent term. We all know what bitterness is. Unpleasant, unhappy face.
That is not really positive ever.
Right.
And if we did like that character, we wouldn't call it bitterness.
Bitterness is a taste perception, and astringency is a sensation.
Right. I agree with that.
And so our mouths don't feel stuck together most of the time unless we're dehydrated or anxious or we've bitten into some unripe fruit. Okay, unripe banana, unripe vegetable, unripe fruit, particularly raw, and then you get this feeling of, as Peter said, of this cotton mouth, but your tongue sticking to the sides of your mouth, your cheeks sticking to your gums. Right.
I always feel it when I have unripe persimmon.
Unripe persimmon is a classic example.
So it's a rather negative.
No, it's probably used more often negatively. But I have sometimes made personally notes to say there's a pleasant astringency here, because a certain amount of astringency, grippiness, is very good.
It explains an overly tannic white wine.
What you get often with just Googling a term on the internet, sometimes the answer is very good, and sometimes it's horseshit. And so here it's sort of horseshit.
I believe if people read this, they're going to think astringency, it's for white wine.
Well, by listening to us, they realize that that's not the case, and whoever wrote that is just simply wrong.
Simply wrong.
Sorry, simply wrong.
I planned this video to show people about how we can use the wine terms, but I'm learning.
We're going to have to make 15 videos out of this at this speed.
What is autolytic?
Autolytic is a characteristic from yeast cells sitting on the wine and the yeast cells breaking down. I think that usually takes years to have a toasty autolytic character. That's usually in reference to sparkling wine. You can also have a lees characteristic, a waxy characteristic, a pleasant characteristic from shorter contact on the lees, on the yeast cells. That's the cells that settle down after the fermentation's over with.
Pleasant or unpleasant?
The characteristic can be either. It all depends upon how healthy the yeast cells are and how one handles it. So at the top of the autolytic character would be either aged vintage champagne or non-vintage champagne that has some old wine added to it, that has a lot of autolytic character, that can have a toastiness and a waxy creaminess from sitting on the yeast cells for many years. Or in white wines that have had lees contact, those wines can have a nice waxy characteristic that covers up astringency.
Right.
If on the other hand you've got bad yeast cells, that can give really funky, unpleasant, dirty characteristics to the wine.
But I've never heard people using this term.
Autolytic. They use it most in the context of sparkling wine. But I mean, that's what you're getting. You're getting the autolytic character from the breakdown of the yeast cells with prolonged contact with the wine.
What is baked? If I say, this wine is baked.
Baked?
Yeah. This wine is cooked. This wine is stewed. Then what would you think?
I'm wondering why it's baked.
If I say so, what do you think?
Baked has a kind of a secondary meaning, I think. It means smoked marijuana.
Smoke marijuana?
I am so baked.
Really?
So this wine is baked. What is he pointing to now? If you want to get baked, drink this wine. So is baking actually a process that you cook the wine?
No, it's about the taste.
Baked is not good. Classically, it's finished wine. Somebody's taken this wine, purchased it, and they leave it in their car. That high temperature causes a loss of fruit flavors, and you get these stewed prunes, almost as if you would bake the fruit. Quite unpleasant.
And is it the same with cooked?
Cooked, stewed, baked would all be variants.
There's one sort of group of wines where, to a certain extent, they actually encourage the baked character, and that's sherry.
And Madeira.
What does fallen over mean?
In the context, it's wine that's over the hill. It got to a point where it suddenly decided, I'm way too old and it died. That's fallen over.
That's not a common term in the wine industry, or at least the people that I speak to. That's not a common term.
I mean, we are around wine all the time, every day, and no one talks about fallen over wine.
Yeah, nobody.
But we say it's over the hill, right?
Over the hill.
We say it's over the hill.
Yeah, it's done, it's
too
gone.
old,
Yeah.
it's done, it's dried out.
What is closed? This wine is closed. This one is open.
So you open the bottle or you close the bottle? What does it mean?
Closed is a wine, you've got it in your glass, so both on the nose and on the mouth, in the palate, where you sense that there's more to come, that there's fruit there, that there's a bouquet there, but it's just not delivering. And you get the sense, based on experience, that there's much more to come, but it's just not there today. It's where the idea of decanting wine came from. Wine is closed, you pour it into a decanter, you aerate it, the idea being that the wine is closed with a little bit of air on it, a little bit of room to breathe, it will open up. So the opposite of closed is open, and the whole process is called opening up.
And that simply, just as Jay was doing, if you have a closed wine in your glass, simply just by swirling it, That's going to give some air in there, some oxygen, chemical reactions take place, flavors come out, and the wine becomes more pleasant.
Yeah.
So this one is not closed anymore.
It wasn't closed when we opened it.
But it's
By
more
definition.
open.
It was closed before we opened it. And after we opened it, it was no longer closed.
That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard.
That's right. I think that's what they meant here, right? What do you mean? When the wine's closed, means you can't drink it because there's still something in the bottle.
Sometimes I really hate both of you. What is cloying?
Cloying usually almost always refers to a sweet wine. Cloying wine would be one that has very little to no tannin, and the acidity levels aren't high enough to balance the sweetness. So the wine tastes very heavy, very sweet, and not enough acid to give it freshness, to give it balance.
Cloying, in food terms, is like peanut butter. It sort of sticks to the roof of your mouth.
It would be sickeningly sweet peanut butter, right? So it's a thickness, but there's sweetness there that is way too high.
What does crisp mean? This one is crispy.
I would say crisp rather than crispy. Crispy is a potato chip. Crisp means sharp, strong, but light, bright.
Quick and intensive.
Yeah.
But if I say crispy?
He gave a crispy talk. Wouldn't make much sense. Crispy is materials.
Crisp is usually applied to white wine. It is a white wine with sufficient acidity to render it lively and crisp, like that fresh, lively character. What it is not is a piece of meat that's been on the barbecue for too long. That's a different kind of crisp.
Yeah. Fresh apple is referred to as crisp.
What is dirty?
Dirty. Sometimes there are people who've described Peter and I as being dirty. You can find in a dirty wine animal smells, fecal smells, meaning shit smells, smells of body odor. There's a lot of bad aromas that can come from the fermentation process, and that would be a dirty wine.
I haven't ever heard people saying this wine smells dirty or this wine tastes dirty.
I wish you have.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fair. Sometimes people use the same term, funky.
Funky.
And funky and dirty would be the same thing.
Then what is the difference between cloying and dull?
You can have a dull wine that doesn't have to be sweet. So dull can either refer to the color of the wine or the appearance on the palate, but both of which relate to the acidity of the wine not having enough acid.
The opposite of dull is fresh.
If you've got a cloying wine, you can either add some very high acid white to it or a little bit of lemon juice to it to try to make it a little fresher. If you've purchased it and you've got it and you feel compelled to drink it.
Have you ever done it?
Yeah. It's called doctoring the wine. Improving it.
What is connected?
Connected is a term that I haven't often heard.
Yeah.
This bottle of wine is connected, meaning it harkens back to somewhere. It's connected, meaning you told me it's Bordeaux. I get it. It's redolent somehow or another of Bordeaux, of the terroir, or whatever it might be. So connected is a sort of beginning of a sense of place.
Or, given the industry in the United States following at the end of Prohibition, the distribution of alcohol was completely controlled by different mob factions. And so people who are involved with the mob are considered to be connected. So it could be wine that's being sold or produced by some people that still have some ties.
That's right. It's connected.
But I think if both of you don't use this term, connected.
Never use it.
I've never heard it. I just sort of surmised what it might be.
Ignore the term.
What does flabby mean?
Flabby tends to be a wine that doesn't have enough acid. Flabby wines usually also have too much alcohol, too much residual sugar, something that is putting the wine out of balance.
90% the lack of acidity, but also the liveliness of the wine. They don't get up and dance. They are.
I remember you have a very special description for being flabby in terms of wine.
What is that?
You always do.
That's true, but it's not a very good description verbally.
Does flabby wine always have a big body?
No,
No?
but usually.
What does foxy mean?
Foxy.
Yeah.
Be careful how you say those words. Foxy in a wine refers to the characteristics, the sort of foxy characteristics on the nose. Typically those come not from grape varieties like Vitis vinifera, but they come from grape varieties like Vitis rupestris, Vitis Dulot. They are not the same kind of grape varieties from which the world's most famous wines are made. Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, those are all Vitis vinifera. In the United States, we get grapes like Catawba. Those tend to have what they call a foxy character. It's a sort of animal character, an animal's den character. It's not related to anything wrong with the winemaking and simply related to the characteristic of non-vinifera grapes.
Some of those, the better New York State, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio wines made from those grape varieties taste just like the grapes, or just like the grape right underneath the skin, and are wonderful and beautiful wines. The lesser wines tend to be a bit charmless and more of this foxy characteristic.
I'm not as forgiving of non-vinifera grapes as Patrick, but if that's what you like, I'm okay with that.
I'd rather drink a foxy wine than a wine with a lot of Brett in it, personally.
He's much younger than me. I won't drink either.
Obviously.
I won't drink either. No. Life's too short.
What does hard mean?
Hard means not soft, obviously, right? And so hard often applies to tannins. Hard wine would have bitter, firm tannins that tend to overpower the wine. A nicer way of describing those wines would be to use the French term vin de garde.
One always says, well, if you can't drink the wine right now, just lay it down for a few years, it's going to be fine. No. A wine that's going to age well, tastes well at every stage of its life. You can say this wine is too young and it needs a few years, but it still tastes good. When they say to you, no, the wine is undrinkable right now, you need to put it away for 15, 20 years, well, I don't think so.
And is the term hard related to harsh tannin?
No.
No?
No. Hard is ungenerous.
Ungenerous.
It's just you're not enjoying it. The wine is not giving of itself. All tied up.
It's painful.
It doesn't want to give of itself.
Unpleasant.
No.
Hard wines are usually unpleasant.
I'm trying to find the easiest term for the viewers, because if you say charming, generous, it reminds me of people.
Yeah, we're always looking for the personality of wine, and we relate that to the personality of people or animals.
And let's face it, most time people are just popping the bottle and they're drinking the stuff. They're not thinking about it in these terms. And so we're just trying to translate wine speak in the wine trade or among wine journalists for people out there who want to go a little bit deeper.
I better ask this question to Peter.
Why?
Because Patrick is gonna smile in evil way. Peter, what does hot mean?
Given the body and the structure of wine, the impression of alcohol is too high. So it is possible to have a 15% alcohol wine that is not hot, because everything else is in balance.
As a consumer, you can make the hot wine better, right? So here, hot is not used as a positive term.
And how can I make hot wine better?
Yeah, you can cool it, either a white or a red. If a wine has too much alcohol, you can pop it in an ice bucket for a while. You can also add a little cold water. Don't add tap water because it's got chlorine, and the chlorine is going to screw things up, but you can add a little cold bottled water will improve it as well. Ice cubes will improve it as well. It sounds like something sacrilegious, but I'd rather have ice cubes in a hot wine. And then if you combine something that's hot in terms of too much alcohol and hot in terms of not being the right temperature, being too warm. That's a deadly combination.
Yeah, yeah.
What does jammy mean?
Jammy means two different things depending upon which side of the Atlantic that you're on. In Europe, it tends to be a negative term. Too much fruit that's somewhat cloyingly sweet perhaps. Whereas in the New World, in Australia, California, Washington State, in describing a very ripe Zinfandel, of having blackberry jam in it. On both cases, it's used for wines that are grown in a fairly warm climate and are very ripe.
For me, jammy is never a positive term.
No? Even for Zinfandel?
Yeah, it's not a positive term. For me, jammy is surmaturité, over-ripeness. And it starts to take the wine to the point where it flips from jammy, which is too much fruit for me for the acid, to almost porty. It's overripe fruit at the expense of elegance and complexity.
So is it like condensed and heavy?
Yes, for me, yes.
In terms of what our preferences are, there are some lovely Lodi Zinfandels. My problem is that when you combine a wine that is very ripe and high in alcohol, and then you put lots of oak on that, the higher the alcohol level in the wine, the more bitter the tannins that you extract from the seeds and from the oak. And then you can have wines that are not only jammy, but also harsh and bitter.
There is at least one wine, and I'm not going to even tell you its name, although it has jam in the name, that sells quite well in the US. In the New World, there is sometimes a positive connotation to jamminess. Never for me, but this is a wine with jam in its name, and it sells well.
What does lean mean?
This wine is lean. It's kind of the opposite of fat. Lean would be thin, light.
Lean is approaching a negative term, but not necessarily negative. Lean is fine and taut. It's the opposite of fat, the opposite of gras. It is absolutely possible to have a lean wine with elegance and complexity and raciness that is outstanding. I love leanness as long as it's not code for insufficient fruit or one-dimensional.
Patrick, do you use it positive term?
Usually. Though again, it depends upon the grape variety. They tend to be higher acid white wines, no oak, no malolactic. That would be a leaner style of wine. So Sancerre can be a leaner style of Sauvignon Blanc. Muscadet is a leaner white wine. You can have leaner styles of red wine. There's a border now between a leaner red and a red that's got a hollow mid-palate. A leaner red and a red that is hard. So that combination of acidity and tannin can become a bit more problematic. Pardon me. Just even thinking about these hard wines makes me want to choke a little bit.
Sangiovese, one of its great characteristics for me, Sangiovese, properly made, outside of Montalcino, where the wines are not lean, the great Chianti Classicos and Chianti Classico Reservas have everything you want and a sort of racy, minerally leanness.
Yes.
That is absolutely positive.
Yep. And works well at the table.
And works well at the table.
I learned this term, lean, from you. So it's always positive for me.
Oh, okay.
But here, being lean, it explains that it means it lacks a perception of fruit.
That is possible.
Sometimes.
It is possible. I see where they're coming from, but it's a very simple definition. It's a different view of fruit. If you think of the fruit in a perfectly balanced wine, or a perfectly balanced wine as a set of concentric circles, whereas the Lodi Zin tends to be big and broad circles, your perfectly balanced Chianti Classico Reserva, small circles, very tight. So lean, but certainly not lacking the fruit. Just a different expression of the fruit.
A Sangiovese that is a leaner style that I could appreciate. So they're saying, where's the fruit in the wine? Whereas I find that wine to be elegant, and I can see different elements in it. So some of it, beauty is in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
And I'm learning English.
Yes, and for those of you that are watching, considering that English is not his native language, Jay does a spectacular job, because we're talking about really nuance in terms of language, and Jay is a master at linguistics.
You think he's understood anything we've said today?
I'm just filming. But can I apply this term lean to people?
Oh yeah, well, leanness in terms of people would be lack of fat. Same with wine. You could be lean with muscle tone or lean without any muscle tone.
It's rather positive.
Yes, you're not carrying any extra weight, but it also implies almost muscle tone, balance, roundness, not roundness corpulence, but roundness and health.
Just like me. Sorry.
You really didn't understand, did you? Just like you.
What does leathery mean?
So leathery is a characteristic, 90%, 95% of the time, even more, with red wine. And it can come from two places. It can come from the grape variety, for example, Mourvedre, and to a lesser extent, Syrah, Shiraz, are leathery. But also the characteristic of leatheriness is code very often for Brettanomyces. Sweaty leather, sweaty horse saddles, that watch strap that you've been wearing in the sun.
For 10 years.
For 10 years.
Yeah.
So leathery for me is not always, but usually a negative term.
You can also find it with another variety, Merlot, particularly in Bordeaux, can give a more elegant leather characteristic to a wine. But that's a sort of a more advanced blind tasting
like
nuance.
From Hermès or Louis Vuitton.
Yeah, or maybe a worn one.
What does raisiny mean?
The wine tastes very ripe, somewhat ponderous, sometimes jammy, sometimes flabby. And so one has to be careful. And then those wines with a little bit of age on them, they go porty, meaning they pick up the characteristics of port, which comes largely from the raisining and the high alcohol that's associated with the very high potential alcohol grapes.
As the grape gets too ripe, it starts to drop off, and it just starts tasting more like a raisin wine.
There are some that were intentionally raisiny that I do like, but for the most part I don't want to drink raisiny wines, not unless the winemaking team intended them to be raisiny.
What does rich mean?
Rich is some bastard who's took my money. Switching gears, a rich wine is one that gives you lots of flavor, lots of ripeness, and in a positive sense.
I agree with Patrick.
I'm really happy when you two agreed.
We haven't disagreed once yet.
Not once today. What's wrong with us? What have you been putting in our wine?
It's rare.
He did come to get me earlier, and I did bitch slap him before I came out here.
What does tar mean?
Or a flavor that reminds one of the aroma of tar. Tar is a characteristic can be a characteristic of Syrah.
Nebbiolo.
Nebbiolo. Tar and roses, you're
Barolo,
right.
Barbaresco.
Yes.
Very much
tar.
Considered a very serious positive is if you get that characteristic of tar.
Yeah.
How about Pinotage?
Pinotage, not so much.
Smoky
character. Not normally tar, because tar is pitch.
Tar is pitch?
Pitch is not pitch and throwing. Pitch being sticky material that comes up from the ground.
The blacktop on the street.
Yeah.
It's tar or pitch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes this boy doesn't speak good American.
I always have to remember to dumb my language down here, because amongst the three of us, I'm really the only one who's a native English speaker. So,
As my father's family in Scotland would say, "Gain bell your feckin' heed, Jimmy." Which translated means, "Go and boil your fucking head, Jimmy." Gain bell your feckin' heed.
I rest my case.
The last question.
Bum, 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 bum.
What does tart mean?
This wine is tart. Yeah, sour.
Effectively, tart is acidic. In the context of wine, is usually somewhat less of a positive character. It's vaguely negative. If you really liked that jolt of acidity on the wine, you would call it crisp. When you call it tart, you're probably saying it's just a little too much.
Or the combination of crisp acidity with some volatile acidity. If you get some, it hasn't been handled all that well, and you get some vinegar characteristic, that can also be tart.
Yeah, sort of unbalanced acidity.
So we reviewed very strange and eccentric wine terms. If you want to know how we can use these terms in actual life, then you can see them on our many other videos. 이럴 땐 이 와인 네이버밴드로 놀러 오시면 와인을 잘 몰라도 편하고 싸게 사실 수 있도록 제가 많이 도와드립니다. 다들 만족하시고 좋아하시더라고요. 가입하는 게 싫으시면 wineking.co.kr로 놀러오세요.